Here's something that stopped me cold when I first thought about it. You already know how long ago Jesus lived. Not the number, but the feeling of it. 2,000 years ago feels like a very long time. It feels ancient, unreachably distant. Here's what I want you to sit with. Abraham felt exactly that way to Jesus. The distance between you and Jesus is approximately the same as the distance between Jesus and Abraham. 2,000 years on each side. You are to Jesus what Jesus was to Abraham. Which means that when Jesus stood in the synagogue and read from the scrolls of Genesis, Abraham felt to him the way Jesus feels to you. That's not a small thing. And once you feel that distance, really feel it, the whole Old Testament starts to make sense in a way that it didn't before. Welcome back to OT in Context. I'm Scott Smith, Sunday school teacher from Michigan who got obsessed with the world that the Bible assumes you already know. In our last episode, we talked about why modern readers struggle with the Old Testament and what we're going to do about it. Today, we're going to give you the single most useful tool I know for navigating Old Testament history, a framework of 5 chapters that are simpler to grasp than you think. And we're going to build that framework using people you already know. Here's the honest challenge with the Old Testament. The time frame is vast. From Abraham to the birth of Christ is roughly 2,000 years, and most of us read it with no mental map of when things happened relative to each other. Was Moses before or after Abraham? Obviously before. Wait, after. How long after David was the exile? A few decades? A few centuries? Most people genuinely don't know. And here's why that matters. When you can't place events in time, you can't understand the story. You end up reading the Old Testament like a novel someone has shuffled randomly. The characters are familiar, but the sequence is a blur. I'm going to give you a framework to hold on to in your head, using people you already carry some sense of. Let me show you what I mean. A few years ago, I placed Jesus at the center of a timeline, and I pulled that timeline in both directions, backward into the Old Testament era and forward into our own. We already established the anchor. You and Abraham are both roughly 2,000 years from Jesus, on opposite sides. Jesus is the fixed point. Abraham on one side, you on the other. Same distance from the same center. But let's keep going, because that 2,000 years between Abraham and Jesus breaks down into 4 recognizable chunks of roughly 500 years each. And on the other side of Jesus, those same distances land on people and eras you already know. Step back roughly 15 centuries before Jesus, and you land in the era of Moses, the Exodus from Egypt, the law given at Sinai. 15 centuries after Jesus, Martin Luther nails his theses to the door at Wittenberg. The Reformation begins. Moses and Luther, same distance from Jesus, opposite sides. Moses and Luther, 15 centuries on either side of Christ, same distance from the same fixed point. 1,000 years before Jesus brings you to King David, the golden age of Israel, the Psalms, the kingdom being built. 1,000 years after Jesus, that puts you in the early medieval world. Stone castles rising across Europe, Viking ships on the northern seas, Rome a fading memory. David on one side of Jesus, the medieval world on the other, 1,000 years in each direction from the same center. 500 years before Jesus brings you to Ezra and Nehemiah, the return from exile, the rebuilding of Jerusalem's walls. 500 years after Jesus is the era we associate with King Arthur, the early Middle Ages after Rome's collapse. Hold the tape measure at Jesus. Pull it equally in both directions. Every landmark on the AD side has a corresponding landmark on the BC side. Same distance from the same point. The Reformation mirrors Moses. The medieval world mirrors David. The early Middle Ages mirrors Ezra. Jesus is the center. The mirror shows you both sides at once. The mirror is just to give a sense of time. I already have a general idea when these things since Jesus fall. Now let's look at the other side and see if knowing how things feel after Christ helps us get a sense of how time felt before Christ. So now let me give you the framework, the 5 chapters that cover the Old Testament story. Before I do, one thing to be honest about. 4 of these chapters correspond to these roughly 500-year chunks that we just mapped. But the first one doesn't. The first chapter covers everything before Abraham, and the Bible simply doesn't give us a timeline for it. 11 chapters of Genesis, an unspecified span of time, and the foundation of everything that follows. We don't need dates for that. There's frameworks for it, but that's not important. We just need to know it is its own chapter, the opening of the story before measured history begins. And I want to be clear about something else. I'm not asking you to memorize dates. What matters right now is sequence, knowing what came before what and roughly how things sit relative to each other. Stories are more interesting than numbers, and you'll remember the stories better when you know which chapter you're in. But don't worry about the dates. Think of these 5 sections as chapters. Every good story has chapters, and they don't have to be equal length. The Old Testament has 5. Chapter 1, Origins. Everything before Abraham. Creation, the fall, Noah and the flood, Babel and the scattering of the nations. 11 chapters of Genesis covering an unspecified span of time. The point isn't to detail every event, it's to establish the problem that the rest of the story spends 2,000 years solving. Chapter 2, The Call, roughly 2000 BC to 1500 BC. This is Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. God calls a single man out of Mesopotamia and begins building a people. The era of the patriarchs. It ends in Egypt, where Jacob's descendants have grown from a family into a nation in slavery. Chapter 3, Exodus and Conquest, roughly 1500 to 1000 BC. Moses, the plagues, the Red Sea, 40 years in the wilderness, Joshua leading the people into the promised land. This is probably the most well-known section of the Old Testament, and it stretches across several centuries. The formal conquest under Joshua begins in the 1400s BC, but actually taking hold of the land is a much longer process. This is the era of the Judges, a recurring cycle of settlement, compromise, foreign oppression, and deliverance that plays out across hundreds of years. The Israelites never fully drove out the inhabitants as God had instructed. By the time this chapter closes and the kingdom era begins, they still haven't finished the job, and that incomplete obedience will cost them for centuries to come. Chapter 4, Kingdom and Collapse, roughly 1000 to 500 BC. Saul, David, Solomon, the golden age of Israel. Then the kingdom splits, declines, and eventually falls. First, the northern kingdom to Assyria in 722 BC, then the southern kingdom to Babylon in 586 BC. The prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, they're all writing in this period. This period ends with God's people in exile, 1,000 miles from home. Chapter 5, Rebuilding and Waiting, roughly 500 to 0 BC, the time of Christ. Persia rises and releases the exiles. Some return. Ezra and Nehemiah lead the rebuilding. The temple is eventually restored. And then, for roughly 4 centuries, no new prophetic books are added to the scriptures. Empires rise and fall, and Israel waits. 5 chapters: Origins, The Call, Exodus and Conquest, Kingdom and Collapse, Rebuilding and Waiting. And here's what I want you to hear underneath all that. Across these 5 chapters, God is doing one thing: preparing the world for the coming of the Messiah. That's the story. That's what you're reading when you open the Old Testament. Not disconnected history, not ancient trivia, not disconnected moral tales, but the long preparation for the arrival of Christ. So why bother with this? Because when you open your Bible to a book like Isaiah and you don't know which chapter of history you're in, you're reading in the dark. Isaiah is writing in chapter 4, Kingdom and Collapse. He's watching the Assyrian Empire close in, with Judah in the crosshairs. He's writing to people who can see the walls closing in. That context changes everything about how you read him. Or take the Psalms. David is writing in the early part of chapter 4, before the collapse. He's the king. He's building a nation. He's also running for his life from his own son. That's chapter 4. Or Daniel. He's been taken into exile at the beginning of chapter 5. A young man in Babylon watching everything his people built get dismantled. His book makes completely different sense when you know which chapter. The framework doesn't reduce the Bible to a study guide. It just gives you the map so you can actually enter the territory. We started this episode with a simple observation. You already know how long ago Jesus lived. Not the number, but the feel for the distance. And that sense of scale is your key to the Old Testament timeline. Because on the other side of Jesus, at the same distance, stands Abraham. And between them, Moses, David, Ezra, each one a landmark in a story that was always moving toward one destination. Which chapter are you in? Ask that every time you open the Old Testament. Changes what you see, and the whole timeline starts to hold together. If this series is helping you see the Old Testament in the way its original audience did, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next episode.